Okay, so as you can see from hopefully the more legible text this time around, today's topic is encounter design. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, my game is a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game, so I'm going to try and keep it system agnostic as much as possible, but where I give specific examples and references, most of them will be 5th edition D&D and probably drawing on my experiences. So I tend to use 3 rules for encounter design. You can see them. Keep the encounter simple, keep it interesting, and have a purpose for the encounter. I'm not a fan of random encounters. I don't think that they serve a purpose in and of themselves. I like the tables and other resources for them because they're great for inspiration purposes. And if you, for example, recently in my campaign, the city was uh, uh, suffered an attempted coup, and I used several random encounter tables to build up kind of a hostile population in the various districts, and they're great for that. I didn't roll on them; I just picked which uh, NPCs I wanted to include and went from there. They're great for that kind of thing, but personally, and no disrespect intended, if they work for you, they work for you. That's great. Everyone runs role playing games in their own way. I just don't like them as filler, I guess. There are far more interesting things you can do than just roll on a table during a long journey. And while this stream, recording, video, whatever, isn't intended to discuss long journeys as such, it's probably something I'll get back to in the future. For now, I'm going to be talking you through how I've approached the encounter that my players are going to experience at the very start of the game. So as a recap, because I said I'd do recaps, last time we played, the party found themselves in the Shadowfell, and they explored some of the castle they found themselves in. They found loads of uh, dead bodies. The party warlock realized that the entire castle was under the effects of a magical spell of some sort, and being tied to the Raven Queen using the Unearthed Arcana Pact of the Raven, he realized that the bodies scattered around were inhabited by spirits, animating forces, and realized that they probably shouldn't poke them or attack them in any way. And so they as I say, they explored some of the castle. They found uh, the Necromancer Lord's bolt hole, and used a ladder they found within that bolt hole to access the roof of the keep, where they found a room with a crystal suspended in midair in this huge mechanical array of some sort, um, feeding energy up into something on the very roof of the keep, and followed some staircases up to that to find this huge brazier covered with arcane symbols and burning with this incredibly blue but heatless flame. Uh, Same warlock, he spent the time required to cast Identify as a Ritual on the crystal, being held the entire time by the party fighter, so they could actually reach the crystal, and discovered that the crystal was essentially powering a Hallow spell to keep all of the spirits in the keep dormant and non-hostile. From from their view on top of the keep, the party quickly realized that the geography of the area matches that of Scour, the city that the campaign's so far taken place in. was in place of this bustling cosmopolitan city is mostly primordial forest. And I highlighted several areas of interest that they could feasibly see from this position, and the um, party monk who follows the way of the Sun Soul decided that they'd had enough of this plane of darkness, shadow, and undeath, and that they wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The party sorcerer warlock, multiclass, contacted his patron, and while no verbal conversation took place, his patron kind of guided his attention to what is obviously a fort or a military installation of some sort in the distance, roughly where they know the Knights Arcana and Scour are situated, and the Knights Arcana being the kind of the magical police. So they quickly decided that they'd head for this fort or whatever it was, ignoring some other signs of civilization and a crumbling wizard's tower of some sort, or crumbling tower of some sort, and left the keep and then entered the forest, this primordial forest. And about half the session was spent exploring the keep, and about half of it was spent exploring this primordial forest. And right off the bat, I wanted to emphasize that this isn't a plane of existence they're familiar with in any way. They don't know what to expect. So when the party rogue went hunting, he found boar adjacent animals, which I just used the boar stat block for, but they didn't look quite as they expected, and I want to subvert their expectations because they're expecting undeath because it's the Shadowfell. They're expecting kind of sentient shadows, things like that. So I wanted things they're familiar with, and I wanted there to be an ecology here rather than just everything is undead and evil and bad. There is life here, it's just twisted. It's not what they know, hence boar adjacent. And then um, that wasn't really an encounter. It wasn't intended to be an encounter. It was just something the rogue said he was looking out for was food, and he has a history with boars, so I figured throw him a bone, and it just makes for a fun scene. The first encounter proper of the entire session, and really the only one, was I wanted like the explicit purpose of this encounter was to highlight the fact that the environment itself can be hostile, and this is something I've tried to convey during the campaign up to this point. We've been playing over a year. Is that the environment can be an actor in certain circumstances, and it's something they've kind of been ignoring when I've thrown hints about this. So I explicitly wanted no initiative tracker, no combat really, no monsters, just players versus the environment. And a while ago, I was looking through a list of kind of random dungeon traps you can have as just for inspiration for a one shot. And one that stuck with me was a room filled with monofilament wire, which required acrobatics checks to cross without taking too much damage. For anyone who doesn't know, monofilament wire is essentially very thin, very sharp, high tensile metal, which will just cut you as soon as you touch it. Obviously, that's not really what you're going to find in a primordial forest. So I decided that in place of the wire, there would be razor sharp leaves, and if the players succeeded on the acrobatics check that they were rolling, and they didn't know why they were rolling it, and I don't really believe in rolling for my players. I like them to be engaged in the game more than anything. So I had them roll, but then they didn't know what they were rolling, and they didn't know what their success was. There was no overt danger. And fortunately, most of them, well, they got halfway through the clearing before someone failed the roll. and well, quote unquote clearing. It was just an area of less densely wooded forest. Um, and they got halfway through the clearing, and then someone failed the roll, and I described how the leaves on the trees themselves just cut through their armor, not leaving permanent damage, but enough to draw blood, and then the dark liquid being absorbed by the leaves. And that's when the players realized that there was danger here, and they kind of all froze for a few moments and figured out what they were doing. And the gnome, creative as ever, he just dropped to the ground and kind of crawled very slowly, avoiding the leaves. Um, and then a few of them kind of just kept pushing through with the acrobatics checks. Then one of them just decided he's going to cut the trees down. And the way I've set this area up and through the descriptions I've been providing, the trees aren't very thick. They're not very strong. They're quite easy to break, and branches certainly are easy to lop off. So they just brute force their way through the clearing, and that was fine. The encounter, quote unquote, had served its purpose. They knew that the environment itself couldn't be trusted, and it was definitely simple. It was just trees. There was nothing moving. There's no initiative to keep track of. The only hit points involved were their own. Um, and I hope it was interesting. They said after the game that they enjoyed it, and I think I mentioned this last time, but feedback is incredibly important. And when it comes to encounter design, certainly, uh, you need to know what your players enjoy and what they don't enjoy. A good example of this is where you think an encounter should be challenging, and you think it's challenging, and it might be challenging, but the players don't find it fun because it's too challenging. It's a narrow balance, and a lot of it is just experience and being able to pick up on physical cues. Obviously, playing over Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or digital services is more difficult for this kind of thing, but it's you kind of have to learn to read your players in a way and pick up on what they're enjoying about an encounter and what they aren't enjoying. And it's not always that easy to do, but sorry, it's necessary to ensure that everyone's having fun. So after this encounter with the Razor Oak, they kept pushing through this forest, heading for this fort, and made camp near what they thought was a meadow, um, with a small rock outcrop in the center of it, with a natural fountain, a spring. And I honestly expected them to investigate it slightly, and they didn't. And one of the key things to remember as a GM is manage your expectations. Your players will sometimes do what you expect them to do, and certainly over a long-term campaign, you get good at guessing what they'll do, but they'll always throw you a curveball. A good example of this is a few sessions ago, the party gnome warlock, instead of figuring out a way of infiltrating the compound like everyone else was, Noble's compound, by climbing the wall or finding another way in, he decided to solo a wandering patrol. Now, the player kind of said that his idea was to draw their attention to make everyone else safe. But I didn't expect that. I expected them to kind of sneak in, maybe minus the half-orc fighter who they'd find they'd help in through another manner. But I did not expect this. This came completely out of the blue. And while it's not difficult to work out what happens after that, i.e., the patrol attacks the gnome and subdues them, it kind of, I don't want to say it threw me for a loop because I don't do that much prep, and again, these sessions are more just kind of a practical explanation, a practical example of theory. This isn't what I would typically do, and I don't know how long I'll be doing them. But I don't prepare all that much, so it didn't matter that he aggroed the guards because I'm good at improvising combat stats when I need to. And as it was, that was right at the end of the session, so had a week to think about what would happen. But it made things, well, it made things interesting. But it made things slightly awkward as well from a player attention point of view because the players had a clear goal. They were infiltrating the compound to find something. Um, in this case, the noble themselves. And one of the party had managed to bluff his way in and had been given explicit instructions where the lord was. Another three members of the party had snuck in and were kind of supporting him. They just climbed over a wall. Uh, and then we start the next session with a combat encounter with, unfortunately, the half-orcs player wasn't there, so they were just tackling their own group of guards. And then there's this solitary gnome warlock who the player had misunderstood one of his spells slightly. So it wasn't. He thought he had second thoughts about the plan, but stuck with it anyway, which was fine. Um, they had this gnome warlock just standing there in front of five guardsmen, with the rest of the party split up from him. And a credit where it's due, they reacted as a party. They worked as a team. They overcame the challenge. The one who knew where he was going, he kept on going and scouting ahead and found the door they needed. And I managed to use the warlock's lapse into unconsciousness because he was reduced to 0 hit points because he was alone and surrounded by five guardsmen, um, to drop some exposition and to progress his kind of personal storyline, and that's fine. I pride myself on the ability to do that, but to give encounters a purpose as my kind of quote unquote rule states. But I think this long rambling story, the takeaway is really that any encounter, ones you've prepared, like I'm going to run you through today, or ones you haven't prepared, like this gnome standing up to the patrol, they can be interesting, they can have a purpose, and certainly the prepared ones, they can be simple, and they should be, because you, as a GM, you have a lot to think about as it is. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with information, and there are things you could do to help. Like you can have players handle initiative tracking, for example, or um, damage tracking, especially in games where there's a static damage value assigned to certain to attacks or to monster attacks and things like that. But for when it's random, quote unquote random, uh, out of the blue encounters like this gnome versus the guards, I was lucky in that I had a week to think about it, and I figured out how I could drop the exposition in and progress the storyline, and how I have a like I have a good understanding of certain of my players will react to certain situations. So I had a general idea of what would happen, um, and it went well, fortunately. But if it happens in the middle of a session, don't be afraid to ask for a few minutes to yourself to say, "Look, guys, I didn't expect this. Um, I need a few minutes to think about how this will go." And for me, for my group, this isn't such a problem because we play in a cafe, so it could be like I can take those few minutes and everyone can get a drink or some cake or go to the toilet or what have you. But you've got to, I suppose, the important thing is that you're all there to have fun, and you don't want to be panicking at the table because that leads to, well, it can lead to mistakes being made and um, not necessarily a lack of fun, but moments where people's focus wanders because you're kind of scrabbling for ideas and inspiration. And just, yeah, just know that it's okay to take those few minutes to think of something to make a random, quote unquote, again, encounter interesting, to give it a purpose, even if that purpose is just like, the best way to phrase it is to teach the players a lesson, but that's not really what I mean, because as a GM, certainly for my style, the idea is to be a fan of the player characters. You don't want to be adversarial. So I guess a better way of phrasing it would be taking this practical example of the gnome warlock. The purpose was just to demonstrate the repercussions of his impulsive nature, and this has actually happened a few times with the gnome, and it's fine. It produces great scenes, and if anything, his rashness is a great way of kind of showing the party that in some situations they do need to act together as a team. When he was first introduced, because the player joined about 7 months into the campaign, maybe 6, 7 months. Um, he wandered off into the dungeon, and the first few rooms were just puzzle rooms, but the last room was trapped, and he triggered the trap, and it got to the point. As context, they were in a flooded dungeon, and the trap was a spinning pillar with blades on it that was causing a vortex and pulling him into it. And it got to the point where I had to kind of take off my GM narrative hat and just address the players themselves, not the character, and just say, if you don't do anything, he's gonna die, because he's not a very strong character, um, and he couldn't swim well enough to pull himself out of the current this spinning pillar was generating. So, as I say, I had to just tell the players themselves that they need to do something, otherwise the gnome would die. And they did. They rallied and they pulled him free. In fact, a lot of the time, that character in particular is saved by the half-orc fighter, which, considering that the half-orc's character is one of my quieter players, giving them that kind of spotlight moment and time to shine is great. And it's one of the reasons I love role playing and I love GMing. It's just those unplanned, completely spontaneous moments of the character does something cool, and a player who wouldn't ordinarily be in the spotlight for whatever reason. Like, for me, I am that kind of player most of the time, and sometimes it does feel like I'm not contributing anything to the game, and then I do something similar, and I feel like I've achieved something in that session, and that's great. And it's a collaborative experience, it's cooperative storytelling, and everyone's there to have fun and to support each other. And that's what encounters like this, like that, or like the guards, that's the purpose you can take away from them. It doesn't have to be some grand exposition dump or world saving event. Sometimes it can just be the purpose of this encounter is to get you working together. And I'm not saying random encounters don't do that, because they do, because they're just mostly just combat oriented. But uh, if all else fails, just kind of fall back on that as a purpose, just to demonstrate that, sure, you're all disparate, unique individuals, of varying moralities philosophies. But at the end of the day, this is a cooperative game, collaborative cooperative game, and the whole point is for your characters to work together. Well, I say whole point. It's intended that your characters will work together to further a goal, and if you're lucky and if all goes well, they'll you'll get some great moments of role playing out of the characters working together. Like my party monk has a very kind of defensive friendship, protective friendship with the rogue because the rogue saved his life once, and that's great. That's completely unplanned. The players had no, they don't talk about. As far as I'm aware, they don't talk about this kind of thing out of the game. I know they have a private chat I don't see, and that's fine. Um, More power to them to discuss aspects of the game without me being present. Um, but I guess that's the success of that specific purpose. Getting them to work together as a team brings them together as a team and then gives them excellent opportunities for role play and character development. So, with that 25-ish minute preamble out of the way, I guess we'll go on to the meat of, well, the point of this entire stream. Encounter design, and more specifically, the encounter that my players are going to experience at the start of the session. So, as I said, they had pretty much only one encounter the entire last session with these trees, and then they make camp at this water meadow where I got distracted and went on about unplanned encounters. Um, so yeah, they thought it was a meadow. I didn't investigate further, and they kind of just settled down about 10 feet away from it in the tree line. And the gnome, once again, during his shift, saw a vulture adjacent bird drinking from the spring and decided to investigate. It was at this point that he realized the meadow was in fact just a body of water, perfectly still, covered by aquatic plant life. And as his foot entered the water and made a splash and some ripples, the bird took fright and flew away. And he thought nothing more of it. He just turned around and went back to the campsite. Um, what the players didn't know was that uh, the the lake, pond, what have you, um, was home to a pair of bone naga. And for those who are unaware, bone naga are uh, gigantic undead spellcasting snakes. They are um, magically gifted, and the bone naga specifically, if I'm recalling my lore correctly, is a what happens when a ritual is enacted to prevent a naga from regenerating or being resurrected, because naga themselves come in two varieties: the guardian and the spirit in the monster manual for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. One being more good aligned, and one being more evil aligned. And when killed, they can kind of resurrect themselves to continue their purpose. The bone naga is what happens when the ritual is performed, as I said, to prevent this resurrection. And they're just cool. It's just a cool creature concept. It's an undead creature, and it. I wanted this encounter, the purpose of it, to one, just demonstrate some more of the more exotic monsters out there. Pretty much everything's been humanoids to this point because of the setup of the campaign, and a few undead, but again they were mostly humanoid undead. And I wanted something different, something the players haven't encountered before. Um, So when the play starts, the rogue who stood last watch, who's on watch when the Naga attacked, had just woken the monk up because of their friendship, um, and they've seen one of the Naga. Unfortunately, the other Naga's stealth roll was pretty high, so the rogue didn't hear it, um, and it's looping around behind them, and its goal is to encase one in its ribcage and then just drag it off to the water where it will drown, and they'll be able to eat it. So the purpose of the encounter, as I say, is to highlight these more exotic monsters. Um, and to obviously there's the whole teamwork aspect, but so far I've had a fairly even mix of encounters in terms of challenge, and Dungeons and Dragons, like a lot of games, it has a challenge meter built in. In this case, a challenge rating assigned to each monster. And if you want a one-to-one fight, it's if a character's over level 5, it's the challenge rating is about one half the character level. So when you get to things that are challenge rating 20 and above, well, 10 and above, I suppose, they're designed for parties to fight and use accumulated party character levels. But that's digression. Yeah, everything so far has been pretty either evenly balanced, apart from the end of level boss fights, because I want those to be memorable and spectacular. But again, I don't want to kill the players. I'm not an adversarial GM. I just want to challenge them, which is why most of the time my encounters are they evenly balanced to the point where it presents as a challenge, but it's pretty easy for the players to win, or it's just easy for the players to win. I mean, it's still going to be interesting and hopefully entertaining for the players, but things aren't things have been more weighted in their favor so far. And what I want to do with this encounter, in addition to highlighting the exotic monsters, is to emphasize the hostility of their surroundings. That is pretty much what it sounds like. Every encounter that I want them to have in the Shadowfell, because it's not what they're used to, because it's an alien realm, it's an alien plane of existence. Only one of them's been here before, and he can't remember much of that because of his backstory. Everything I want, every encounter, pretty much with the flora and fauna, is going to be challenging. Again, I'm not out to kill the players, but these encounters are going to test them, which is why I've thrown 2 undead spellcasters at them. And if the encounter turns out easier than I intended, that's fine. I don't care all that much, as long as the players feel challenged and enjoy the encounter. Um, it's just much like with the Razor Oak. I want to hammer home the fact that everything in the Shadowfell is kind of kill or be killed, and then be raised and made to kill or be killed again. Also, you'll note my spelling. If you can't tell from my accent, I'm English, uh, so some of my spellings might be strange to you. Yeah. So my 2 purposes are to highlight the exotic monsters now that we're out of the city, and going forwards, leaving the city will be doing more of this, and also to emphasize the hostility of the Shadowfell as just this plane of unending bleak despair. Um, I I think two purposes to an encounter is probably best to have as a maximum, because otherwise it's not simple. And for people who enjoy more preparation time, like this video may run to be an hour like the previous one, but the actual preparation will be like 10 minutes worth. Everything else is just me running my mouth. Um, yeah, if you have more than two purposes to an encounter, you run the risk of it being too complicated, or um, you getting lost in the details if you enjoy preparing. Uh, sorry, if you enjoy devoting a lot of time to preparation. So I like to stick at two. Usually it's just one, but two is an upper limit. And those are kind of the guiding principles of the encounter. And a lot of it, this is internalized. It's just stuff I do, and I'm using these streams as a way of externalizing it, of writing it down and understanding it better, so I can improve on my technique. Um, so even though we always have a purpose, is at the bottom of the list. That list is in no particular order. I usually start with purpose first, and then the other two are the guidelines for the driving principles of the purpose. So with that said, keeping it simple, I'm having two actors. I'm having two Bone Naga. Uh, really, that's it. There's no chance unless the party suffers horrendously in the encounter. There's not going to be anyone riding to their rescue. It's them versus these two snakes. And while I'm going to talk about something in a moment and keep it interesting that does add a layer of complexity to the encounter, um, I'm going to have. Well, I'll talk about that there. So keep it simple. It's two Bone Naga and the party in some woods. There's no ritual that they need to stop, and where there are objectives in an encounter, um, or indeed where there are multi-part objectives in an encounter, uh, those can still be kept simple. It's not 100% realistic, but you can always you just make the objectives obvious. So if they've got a ritual to stop, the priest chanting reaches a crescendo, and shadows start cloaking the ritual, the sacrifice, and you make it obvious that they need to stop the ritual now, or even just disrupt it. You don't have to have it kind of like the priest just does this monotone chant and then suddenly the ritual ends. Because while that may be more plausible, more feasible, it's not as narratively satisfying. And and this is really why I don't like random encounters that much. They don't forward the narrative in a meaningful way. I mean, sure, you can give them a purpose, you can assign them a purpose, and you can have them do stuff, but in and of themselves, they don't forward the narrative. They're not a story beat. And having things simple helps you emphasize the story beat over the mechanics, if that makes sense. And certainly for my style of GMing and a lot of the people I know, they like we favor narrative over mechanics. And even like D&D has 3 core rule books. Obviously, it's a mechanic heavy game, but it's not as mechanically heavy as other games. And even then, we get caught up in a rule and decide that for that particular instance, the narrative trumps the rule. Um, a good example is spell components with a listed cost. Uh, a lot of the time, for the horrendously expensive spell components, we tend to ignore them unless it becomes uh, kind of narrative worthy. A good example is recently the campaign I'm a player in. Um, my character committed patricide and um, went looking for a resurrection ritual essentially, and found the temple willing to do it. But because we didn't have the the diamond, the horrendously expensive diamond needed, and we didn't have any way of purchasing it, that became a quest in and of itself to get this diamond, um, given to us by the priestess who was going to perform the ritual. So that's cool. That works. But um, again, when keeping it simple in an encounter design, whether it's just the trees or a ritual or what have you, um, my style favors narrative over mechanics. I'm always going to do something, narrate something, enact something that, even if it's just for that scene, has a cool narrative or forwards a narrative of some sort or provides a springboard for a narrative. So yeah, the priest might be trying to conduct the ritual as quietly as possible, but there's always going to be a signifier. Like the torch is going to flare at an appropriately dramatic moment to just draw the attention of the player characters, who might be embroiled in a fight with the cultists, to the fact that this is happening. It's happening now, and you guys should probably do something about it. And this leads into the keeping it interesting, because the narrative is what makes the game interesting. I I I have aphantasia, which means I don't have a mind's eye for most things. If I focus, if I really concentrate, I can kind of sort of picture things. So, but I work mostly on um, experiential memory, and uh, I do a lot of writing in my spare time. So I'm used to describing senses that, obviously, sitting around a table in the cafe, we're not going to be experiencing those things. So for me, I can't rely on just visual imagery to keep something interesting. So I try to do something when I narrate the battlefield and the environment stuff. I try to narrate interesting things that might be visual, but they could easily be sounds, smells, um, kind of instinctual feelings, or the way the air feels warm and gelatinous as you move. So for this particular encounter with the boat naga, um, as I said, it's how I want to make this interesting is adding a layer of complexity to the entire situation, but I'm going to have it all on an index card, which, if you don't have any and you're running games or you're considering running games, index cards are incredibly useful. Index cards or note cards, whatever you know them as, they're kind of like a 3-inch by 5-inch piece of card with lines on it. They're great. You can just jot those down, and then something you can erase, or you can just kind of more use them for other purposes later. There's also things like magnetic post-it notes with dry erase surfaces. I would use those, but I try to keep the weight down in my GM kit because I have to travel to the cafe and I don't drive, so I walk. And the player's handbook alone is heavy, and then you factor in dice and the pawns I use when we use gridded combat, and it all gets a bit much. So index cards, very useful. I'm going to have these, I think, 3 aspects of the environment written down on index cards for easy reference. And we might not use a map for this encounter. I'm going to put it to my players so they can decide if they want one or not. And the index cards just means that it's there even if we're not using one. Um, I suspect they will. My players seem to prefer maps over theatre of the mind, and that's fine. We do play in a public environment where uh, hearing what I'm saying is difficult sometimes, as is hearing what the players are saying, and the background noise is distracting from time to time. So I don't mind that we use maps a lot. Um, I like the tactile nature of them. Uh, so even if we don't, I say I'm going to write these three things on an index card. And following on from my previous stream with kind of like the three descriptive phrases to describe places. I'm going to borrow a leaf from I think it originated in the Fate rules by Evil Hat, but certainly it's in the uh, Marvel Heroic Role Playing by Margaret Weiss Productions. In that in an attempt to emphasize to my players that the environment can be as much an actor in encounters as they or the NPCs, because I want to drive environmental interaction, and I've tried to do it several times, and it hasn't worked. They just haven't really picked up on the clues that they could interact with the environment to benefit them. So this time I'm going to have kind of like three static descriptive phrases with mechanical effects. Um, so they're going to be fighting in dense undergrowth, which it's just difficult terrain. There's no special effect tied to it. They're just fighting in difficult terrain. So for people who aren't familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, um, difficult terrain essentially, uh, well, every time you move 1 foot of your movement allowance per turn, it costs 2 feet of movement. You travel at half your speed essentially, um, and so that's the first aspect, as I say. From Fate uses aspects a lot for kind of scenes and for people, uh, things you can interact with or gain benefit from. Um, and if the players ever end up in the elemental planes or something similar, I'll probably bring in the environmental tilts from Onyx Path's Chronicles of Darkness, because they're just kind of scene-wide environmental effects. And obviously I'll tweak them and reskin them because they're not designed for this system, so they might not. Well, they probably won't work exactly as as is. But it's the joy of GMing. You take what you like from other games and just reskin it, put it in your game, and boom, it works, and hopefully it's cool. So as I say, the fighting in dense undergrowth counts as difficult terrain. It's kind of like, for most of them, waist high brambles, not thick enough to pierce their armor, or really, it's not going to deal damage. It's going to scratch them. Actually, the only character not wearing armor, apart from the monk, is unavailable this week anyway. So the monk's really the only one that's going to get some scratches, but it's not going to deal damage. It's just a superficial thing. It's just trying to hammer home the fact that their options in this fight are extremely limited in terms of movement. Um, there's going to be, on top of the dense undergrowth, because this is a primordial forest, it's heavily wooded. So the entire fight, every actor gains a +2 armor class bonus versus ranged attacks. And this is just to represent the ability in combat to duck behind cover briefly when something hits you. If it comes up, this bonus might not apply to surprise attacks or attacks from hidden creatures. For people not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, the AC is a usually a static value your character has that determines how easy or hard it is to hit them in combat. The higher the better, because you have to roll equal to or over than to the AC to actually hit them in combat. And I don't think that this uh, the close pack trees would really benefit in melee because melee combatants can kind of just dot around the cover and try and hit you and then move back out of your threat range. But um, I think it's emphasizing again the environment being an actor. In this instance, it's being a neutral actor, um, but it's still very present all the same. And I'd like a third, just because rules of three make sense to me. Um, I'd like a third kind of aspect to the environment, but I can't currently think of one. And you don't always need three of everything. Two is fine, like two purposes. And obviously, the more environmental rules you include, the um, more complex the encounter becomes, and that contravenes the keep it simple point. The idea is to make something interesting by adding maybe a little complexity, but ultimately keeping it simple. And if these things don't work out for me, I'm not afraid to throw them out. If it just becomes a chore that everyone's moving at half speed, um, the thrashing of a Naga can clear a few squares, or the players can just clear the undergrowth with an attack or a bonus action, say, in the D&D action economy. I suppose, kind of going back to the purpose of other encounters they've had, there could be um, like with the boar thing, and trying to hammer home that there is an ecology here. Being a heavily wooded area with dense undergrowth, there is going to be life. There's going to be um, insects. There's going to be rodents. There's going to be things like boar. So the local ecology could play a part. Um, it might be just as simple as there's a 5-round countdown before something is attracted by the sounds of violence. Um, Probably counted on initiative 20. And but the smaller members of the ecology are still present, and the players can track them if they wish. I think that's it. That's really all I wanted to cover today. We are pushing nearly an hour again. Um, so to recap, for encounter design, have a purpose for your encounters. Usually a narrative one, just to forward the narrative or to have an interesting narrative beat, or allow the players to have a moment of cool role playing. And something I entirely forgot to mention, an encounter doesn't have to be combat. As with the tree example, that wasn't combat, that was an exploration encounter. But a social encounter is equally viable. Um, and some games have specific kind of rules for social combat, which is cool. D&D doesn't, and because it's not really the focus of the game. It's heroic, high fantasy, swords and sorcery kind of thing. Um, but have a purpose to the encounter, even if it's just like spotlight one of the players, make them feel awesome for however long the encounter runs. And then use your purpose or purposes, probably maximum of 2 to be on the safe side, as principles, as guidelines to build the narrative of the encounter around, while also keeping the encounter simple and interesting. Because the last thing you want is a player or players to lose interest in the game, because that's not fun for anyone at the end of the day. And the idea of tabletop role playing is to have fun, to tell a cool story, to make memories with your friends or to make friends. And I think that's all for today, really. Um, Obviously, if this doesn't work for you, that's fine. This works for me. This is how I approach encounter building, and I don't expect it to work for everyone. But if you like it, let me know. If you don't, equally let me know. Tell me what you don't like about it. This is going up on YouTube, YouTube channel of the same account name, and I think that's it. So I guess until next time, I hope your role playing goes well and that you enjoy the stories you're telling.